Okay, wonderful to see everyone. Welcome back to our Parsha Insights as we've moved from the great dramas of last week's Parasha of Yitro and the father-in-law, son-in-law dynamic that we explored last week, and of course of the revelation at Sinai. And this week, to a certain degree, we get down to business. This is Tachlis, because this week is Mishpatim, which are the laws. And suddenly, instead of this very dramatic description of the thunder and the lightning, we encounter one law after the next, after the next, after the next, having to do with all parts of life, and certainly so much of the Talmud is based on verses in our Torah portion this week, in particular the tractates of what's known as Nezikin, which are those of damages, of whether it's property damages or damages to personal being, personal responsibilities, civil law, all of that kind of finding its source in our Torah portion this week. And we're going to really hover today for a little bit around that very first verse. And that's some of the challenge of learning Midrash. When I sit down to prepare a class, I don't get that far into the Parsha because there's so much meat. And here we are in the first verse, very simple verse. And suddenly we're digging quite deep. So let's take a look. I'm going to share the source sheet. Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. That's the verse. That's the only verse we're really going to look at in the Parsha this week. These are the rules that you shall set before them. So any questions first on this verse, or any aspects, if we're studying through the eye of Midrash, what needs elaboration in this verse? Feel free to shout it out if you'd like.
Is there a difference between rules and laws?
Good, great. So in our tradition, that would be one approach, would be what is this word mishpatim, the rules? And after all, don't we have, we know it from the Passover Seder. Don't you remember the question of the wise son? What are these chukim, mishpatim? Well, what are all the mitzvot? And the different words that we have for rules and laws, just as the Eskimos purportedly have many words for snow, so we have lots of words for laws, maybe, and other things as well. But what's the nature of that word mishpat, right? Connected to so much in the judicial concept. The word shofet, a judge, comes from this word mishpat, and so on. It's and we'll see this word later on in a different parsha in Deuteronomy, shoftim. Parashat Shoftim is the same word, judges, Shoftim v'shotrim. So what is this word mishpat? Good. That's question number one, area for clarification number one. What else?
How do you say courthouse?
Beit mishpat.
Thank you.
The Supreme Court in Israel is Beit Mishpat Elyon, the upper court, Supreme Court.
I'm thinking of mishpatim, or judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking that, rule is one thing and judgment is something that you're judged on. So it's something, these are rules. This is what, you have a rule, don't, whatever, turn the lights off, turn the lights on. Those are rules. But judgments means that something that you're going to be judged upon for now and for always.
Yeah, good. So I would say, firstly, when it comes to these translations, it is very difficult, and we'll see that later on a little bit more in another verse that we're going to translate from a different.
Would you say that the words are a bit unusual? The way it's said in English, anyways, you shall set before them. Not that you shall command them, but you shall set before them, almost like the Shulchan Aruch preparing the table.
Excellent point, Stephen. I don't know if you've read on, but
no, I didn't. I did not.
Basically,
I only read the two lines.
Rashi should have checked with you before writing his commentary, because what you said basically hit the nail on its head of exactly what Rashi says, and we'll see that in a moment. But you're right, the unusual phrasing of "you shall set before," you shall place or set before them. And just to go back for a moment, the word rules, again, translation you have to make a decision as to what it's going to be. The idea of mishpat, you're right, about judgment, and perhaps it's anything that could one day find itself in court. Maybe that's a way in which we could explain the context of of the Torah portion. You could sue over these things. You could become penalized or imprisoned because of the violation of the coming rules. It's something that would be in the jurisdiction of the legal system. That's basically what we're introducing right now. And Rashi, as Stephen prophesied or anticipated, Rashi says, Amar lo, what is this phrasing? You shall put before, you shall place before them. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. God said to Moses, Al talel datcha lomar, don't consider saying the following, Eshne lahem haperek v'halacha bed o gimel pamim, I'm going to teach them this chapter or this halacha or this law twice or thrice, ad shetehei sdura b'fihem k'mishpatam, until it's so accustomed to in their mouths, until they basically memorize it. I mean, it's not just that I'm just going to teach them by rote. Ve'eni matriach atmid lahavinam tamei davar perusho, and I'm not going to impose on them, on myself, to explain it to them to the depth of its understanding. It's not just the kind of thing that you do by rote. Lekach ne'amar, therefore it says, Asher tasim lifnehem, you shall place before you. We'll read this, just like Keshulchan ha'aruch, just like a table that is set, umuchan le'echol lifnei ha'adam, and is prepared to eat for consumption before each and every person. And so in the 16th century, when Rav Yosef Karo, sitting in Tzfat, in the Ottoman Syria, or the Ottoman Empire in Tzfat in the 16th century, and when he's sitting there and having written his book of Jewish law, is saying, well, what am I going to call this book? He looked at this Rashi, just as Stephen said, and said, you know what? The Mishpatim, the laws, are supposed to be like a Shulchan Aruch, like a set table. This is where Rav Yosef Karo got the name of the core book of Jewish law, was from this Rashi on the first pasuk, on the first verse of our Torah portion, this week. We could take this analogy further, the idea of a set table, and once you've already set this up, that a set table, a Torah study is going to remind us of a set table, or it's going to be reminiscent of a set table, then maybe we can apply other concepts. I have a teacher, I've mentioned before in various contexts, Yaakov Perlman, who was my teacher in I believe it was 4th and 6th grade at Hillel School in Rochester, New York. He was from Manchester, and he left the school to take a new job at a certain point, and that new job was to become the chief rabbi of Ireland. So he went from teaching elementary, chief rabbi of Ireland. He is now living in Baltimore, Maryland, and he wrote a book on the Parasha, which I was fortunate enough to acquire over the course of the pandemic. I don't remember at what point in the pandemic, but I recently acquired his book on the Parasha. And his comment on this week's Torah portion has to do with this Rashi. And he says, think about what a set table looks like, and think about the emotions that it invites. You see a set table, and you can imagine a table with lots of seats around it, and each seat has a plate, right? Remember those things that we used to, dinner parties? Remember when we used to have family over and would sit around, and the conversation and the joy and bringing out each dish and what that meant in terms of feeding people and providing for people, and all of that, all of those emotions are taken from the dinner table and placed within the context of Torah study as well. We have to approach Torah study with that same anticipation that one would a meal with friends and family, with people we love. That's what Torah study is going to be all about. Okay, so that's Rav Yaakov Perlman. So far we've seen this verse and the Rashi on the verse.
And but what troubles me in this verse, before we go further, is that you're telling them all these rules and you want them to understand, but you don't really care. You're not going to take the trouble to really make.
What is it stopping?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost
them
you.
Understand,
I
but
lost
then
you for
you
a
won't
second.
go further as a teacher.
I lost you for a second. I'm sorry. Would you mind repeating that question? I think you.
Okay.
Is it for just for me or for everyone?
Okay,
Right.
so he's setting the table and giving them all the rules as much as he can, 2 times or 3 times, but he doesn't really care if they understand at the end.
That's the warning. So God is saying to Moses, don't do the thing that you just described. Don't just hand it over to them. And just as a routine, as a rote thing, make sure they understand it. God says, Lo ta'aleh dat chalomar. It should not enter your mind to say that it should just be fed like fast food. If we're going to take this analogy, we may as well take it all the way, right? Don't say that it should be like fast food. This should be the finest culinary experience with people you love. You should understand it to its depths. You should savor every flavor of the Torah and not just once or twice or 3 times or 4 times until you know it. Right? It's not just about laning. It's about understanding. That's the Rashi. Thank you.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
What happens to those laws that defy rational understanding, like when you distinguish between chukim and mishpatim, the rational and the unrational?
Yeah, good point. So some of them have, presumably, according to some, have no ta'amim. That's not a universal opinion. Have no ta'amei mitzvah, have no reasons, rationality. Classic examples are shatnez, are the prohibition against mixing wool and linen. A classic example is the red heifer, is the slaughtering of the red heifer as a purification ritual. There are a number of other examples of what's known as a chok, or a law without logic. But that's, number one, not according to everyone. Many people do give reasons for these laws, and those are the exceptions. So that we could treat those in a different way, one at a time. But I would say the general rule that he's putting out here is that you have to understand it. Yeah, there may be exceptions within the system. That's for sure. Okay, so the Talmud Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which, just to speak extremely briefly, there are 2 Talmuds. When we talk about the Talmud, we're really referring to 2 Talmuds. There's the Talmud Bavli, which is the Babylonian Talmud, which is the big brother, which is the more developed one, which is the more sophisticated one. It's the more extensive one. And it's also the one that is edited in a more readable way. The Talmud Yerushalmi, what they call the Palestinian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, whatever you want to call it, they were basically being written around the same time in 2 different locations. One was being written in the land of Israel in the 3rd and 4th century, which is under the Byzantine rule, the Eastern Roman Empire at the time. And that's what we're about to see. And then the Babylonian Talmud was being written in the exile. And that's where the primary students of Torah were, the yeshivas of Surah and Pumbedita and all those places, which I read just the other day that linguistically, I won't go into it now, but one can connect Pumbedita, which is mentioned in the Talmud, one of the great yeshivas in the time of the Talmud, that linguistically it's the same as the word Fallujah, and that places that have come into common parlance now, and in particular in world politics and geopolitics, that there's Jewish history in each of these places, and okay, for another time. So the Jerusalem Talmud on Tractate of Avodah Zarah says the following. They're going to quote the same sages. So the structure is, you have the Mishnah, which is written in the land of Israel, and then commentary and elaboration on the Mishnah happens in 2 different paths. One with the Babylonian Talmud, and one with the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, Babylonian Talmud, when we talk about Shas, when we talk about studying the entire Talmud, that's the Babylonian Talmud. That's 63 tractates. That's a much more developed concept. The Jerusalem Talmud is much more limited. Interestingly, the Babylonian Talmud does not have commentary on certain things that apply only in the land of Israel. So much of the agricultural law has no commentary from the Babylonian Talmud. Just doesn't exist because it wasn't relevant for the people living in Babylonian Talmud. I had a question today. Somebody called me from a student called from Israel to ask me questions about the observance of the sabbatical year. And I had to tell them, look, I really don't feel comfortable enough in my own grasp of these laws. Find a teacher in Israel who can guide you, because these are things that are relevant only in the land of Israel. Okay, so the Jerusalem Talmud says the following. Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, Rabbi Chagai, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said the following. They quote this verse. And this verse we'll look at in the Hebrew for a moment. kivasim, you shall have. So basically what the context of this chapter of Proverbs is you can't take it with you. Is that we have things here in this world, but don't invest too much importance in this world, but just know that there are certain things that are here to take care of you right now. And one of those are kivasim, which are lambs or sheep, lilvushecha, for your clothing, umechir sadeh atudim. And these are he-goats. Atudim are he-goats or rams. Mechir sadeh, the price of the field. So they say, the commentators say, you know, you can, with what you sell, having grown off of your field, you can purchase rams with, which in turn you can use to breed more. You know, it's a cyclical thing that you can breed more sheep and therefore have more wool and so on and so forth. There's just a lot going on there. So the Talmud is saying, wait a second, these words, kevasim, the word kevasim or keves or a lamb is similar to the word kivashim, which means to overcome or suppress. It's a different word, but they share the same letters. So what do they mean? Ha-ketzad. B'sha'a she'talmidim k'tanim kavosh lifneim divrei Torah. When your students are small, are young, you have to suppress the secrets, or that, it doesn't say secrets, the translation says secrets, but it says the words of Torah. You have to be selective. To use a more loaded word, you have to censor. For when teaching children, you can't teach everything. Higdilu v'na'asu ka'atudim, when they grow up and they become like rams, the idea of they become stronger physically, probably not. I mean, not necessarily, but stronger in terms of their intellect and emotional strength and experiences. At that point, galeh lahem razei Torah. At that point, you can reveal the secrets of the Torah, says the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay? And then it says, by the way, there's an important point to be understood here. This supports Vida Messiah. Vida is the same word in Aramaic. The Daled and the Zayin are interchangeable from Hebrew to Aramaic, to the point where the Aramaic word for gold, for example, is dahava, as opposed to the Hebrew zahav. So it's going to be, anytime you see a daled, you'll often know. So this word means zeh, like this. Vida Messiah, and this supports Lamadatani Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, what Shimon bar Yochai said, these are the laws that you shall put before them. Here, look, it translates it as laws, not as rules. So it says we have another teaching in a similar way. Just as this pudding is not revealed to everybody, so you do have permission to immerse yourself in words of Torah only before legitimate people. What does it mean that this pudding was not revealed to everyone? What do you think that means? That statement, this pudding of the Torah was not revealed to everybody, means that the Torah was given to Jews and not to the whole world. It was selectively given, the Torah. So just know, it's being placed before you. The Torah is not being published. It's not being posted online in a way that's available to everyone. The Torah has been given to a group of people in a particular time and a particular place. And now, what we learn from that, from the selective giving of the Torah, that's what the verse is teaching us, is also to be selective in how you learn Torah. That's what the Talmud Yerushalmi is teaching. And I say that in light of a conversation that has been raging amongst the online social media Torah study community this past week. There's what has become a very popular, or becoming more and more popular, a woman in Boston who is studying Daf Yomi, and occasionally, not every day, but posts a reaction to the Daf, to that day's Torah portion. But it's not a reaction like you or I might publish. If we had a reaction, we might have an opinion, we would say it. She is doing it in the most social media savvy way. You look at her video, it's interchangeable with any other video. She could be talking about about makeup. She could be talking about anything in the world with all of the graphics and the filters and everything they use, and the language, also using language that that would be deemed not for synagogue consumption. And this is how she's presenting in many think, and I think, a brilliant way. She's presenting Daf Yomi to a new group of followers in a very cutting edge way. But again, once this gets out, then in comes the attacks and people saying and quoting and pointing to this and saying, wait a second, you should be learning words of Torah, not from anyone, not from anybody who pops up on the internet, certainly not from this person who is not an observant Jew. She was raised Orthodox, but she doesn't claim to be Orthodox anymore. But here she is studying Torah. And they say, be careful who you learn from. That's the approach. So part of that is based in the same approach that's guiding this section of the Talmud, which is just as the Torah was selective in how it was delivered, so too we have to be selective in how we receive it.
So they're actually saying only before kosher people, because
Yeah.
it says gesherim.
Gesherim, right. Kosher in the general sense, how we might use it.
Right.
A kosher yid.
Gesherim.
Yeah, a kosher person, right? So it's fascinating. I encourage you, if you want the contact, or if you want more information, I'm happy to share the links to her content, which is fascinating. But it's worthwhile considering the both sides of the argument. At the very, I think she's brilliant, but both sides of the argument. So far,
put the link on the chat, Rabbi, or send it out or something,
I can try to. I don't know that I can put a link
or perhaps after that.
into the chat. It's easy enough for me to get. But if you send me an email, I'll send you right away. I'll send you the link right away.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, could you send it, please? Not the
Okay.
in the chat.
So we have seen. So we started with Eila Mishpatim. We saw Rashi talking about the idea of placing and what that means in terms of Shulchan Aruch, and then the Talmud Yerushalmi, which said the placing has to do with a selective placing, being deliberate with where the Torah is put and where the Torah is received. And we're going to look at one more section of the Midrash, and by doing so, understanding that what the Midrash will often do is put together verses that really have nothing to do with each other at first glance, but share a word or share a concept. And so we turn to the verse in Mishle, in Proverbs, in the 29th chapter of Proverbs, that says, Melech b'mishpat ya'amid, by justice a king sustains the land. V'ish, and I'm sorry I left this translation in, because ignore the word fraudulent. Just we'll take the Hebrew for what it is. V'ish trumot yeher sena, and a person of trumot. So anyone want to venture etymologically, what does this word look like to you? Trumot.
Truma. What's truma?
Yeah.
What's
He
truma?
sacrifices truma.
Truma is a descriptive term. Something was connected to sacrifices. Yeah, there was a truma. Was
like a donation.
Okay, good. So in modern Hebrew, truma is a donation. Good, and we have Parshas Truma, right? That's coming up next week. We have Parshat Truma, so it's very timely. The idea and as Sandra said, the idea that in biblical times and the Torah describes truma not just in the general form of donation, but specific portions that were set aside, that were allocated for the Kohen, or to be consumed in Jerusalem. There were many different types of truma. You could take truma from animals, truma from dough. There are a lot of different nuances. There's a whole tractate that deals with the concept of truma. And Rashi says, what's this word truma? And by the way, to truma, the actual etymology of truma comes from those words, those letters in the middle, resh mem, or resh vav mem, which means ram, which means elevated. Truma is something that's been elevated, separated in a way of lifting it up. Ram, we talk about God being Kel Ram Vanisa. God is elevated and uplifted. Ram. Even in Arabic, how do you say, how you say the God on high? In Arabic?
Aliyah.
is Ram Allah.
Allah. Oh, the same as the city.
Allah. Right? That's the same word, the same etymology. Truma is something that's been elevated. So Rashi says, what is a person? Ish trumot. What is this? He says a haughty person. Why? Ish geut. Why? Because he's elevated. He's uplifted. His head is held high. Somebody who's haughty, who is looking down on people, who doesn't care to take time in judgment. And okay, so that's one interpretation, and we won't get into the proof text, but okay. And the Metzudat Sion, another commentary on the prophets and the scriptures, says no. There's a different interpretation. Inyan hafrasha. It's the notion of separating something. Truma is the notion of separating something. So now read this back. And what do you mean? So melech b'mishpat yamid aretz. So the king establishes the law, and the person. So according to Rashi, the haughty person destroys it, tears it down. That's according to Rashi. According to the Metzudat Sion, the person who separates, the separatist, the person who is divisive, who creates separation, that person will take it down, will take the system down. That's the verse. And okay, we won't get into.
Oh, what year was Metzudat Sion? What is it?
I don't know. I don't remember offhand. I'd have to look that up. But if anybody type it in, let us know. We'll happy to look at that. But the Malbim, okay, we'll skip this for a moment. The Malbim, another commentary, more modern commentary, notes that we're talking about two different people, a melech and a kohen. And ish trumot is actually referring to a kohen, or the kohen gadol, and you have to be on the same page. You have basically the political leadership being the melech, and the religious leadership being the kohen gadol. And if the king, the political leadership, is establishing the law, then the religious leadership needs to uphold their end of the deal, or else they can bring everything down. The religious leadership can undermine the entire system if it's not sufficiently in line, or if it's corrupt. That's what the Malbim says, but that's for another time. But I wanted to look at this midrash, because I think this is a fascinating midrash, and this is really what we're going to look at today. So, and this midrash refers back to that verse. So Scripture says, "Ve'ela hamishpatim," and this is the midrash Tanchuma on our Parasha. This is the last thing we're going to look at today. Zeh she'amar hakatuv. So now we're going to introduce a different verse. Melech b'mishpat yamid eretz v'ish trumot yaharsena, the verse that we just saw in Proverbs, right? So our starting point was in Exodus, was in our Torah portion, and then we quote the verse for Proverbs, which talks about mishpat, which shares a word. So what does that mean? Malka shel Torah. We're talking about the melech, right? Melech b'mishpat yamid aretz. Malka shel Torah b'mishpat shuhu oseh. That the Torah, the king, which is the Torah, establishes the law. Ma'amid et haaretz, and that sustains the world. Ma'amid, from the word la'amod, which means to stand, but if this is the causative form, it causes the world to stand. Ve'ish trumot yeharsena, and then what is the second part of the verse? That a person of truma, here he uses the Metzudat Sion's interpretation, the separatist, the person who sets themselves apart, will destroy that which is the Torah is trying to build. What are we referring to? Im mesim adam atzmo truma hazo. If a person makes themselves like a piece of truma, like a piece of separated, sanctified food, or whatever it is that's dedicated only for the holy, for the holiest of places, shemushlachat bezavit habayit, that if a person sets themselves aside by secluding themselves in the corner of the home, and they say to themselves, "Oh, Omer, mali b'torah chatzibur. What do I need all of this public nonsense for? What do I need this community politics for? Let me just stay home alone. Let me separate myself, sit in my house, just like a truma, separated. You can't use it. Mali b'dinehem, what's with their laws? Let them deal with their laws. I'm going to live my life. They're going to do it. Society's going to do what it's going to do. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Mali lishmoa kolam. What do I have to do to listen to them? Why do I have to tune into what they're saying? Shalom aleich nafshi. Let my soul be at peace. Let me not be disturbed by what's happening in the world. Harezeh, the Midrash says, Harezeh machriv et haolam. This kind of person destroys the world. Heve v'ish trumot yeharsena. That's what the verse means when it says that a person of trumot, a person of who separates themselves, of truma, of separating, will destroy the world that the melech, b'mishpat, that the king with judgment establishes. That's how the world is destroyed, is by people who say society, laws, norms, issues, problems, leave me alone. I'm just going to stay in my house and do my thing. That's a very powerful call to action that this Midrash is saying, to get involved, to make a difference. And then it gives, finally, as the Midrash often does, gives an example or gives an anecdote. Maaseh b'Rebbi Asi. And I'm noticing, as I'm reading this, which I didn't notice before, that the translation has it as Rabbi Ami, and here it has it as Rabbi Asi. I don't know Rabbi Asi, but I don't know. I have to look in the originals and look at some to see which rabbi it was. So, with apologies to the rabbi, it's either Rabbi Asi or Rabbi Ami. Kishahaya mistalek min haolam, when he was about to die. Nichnas ben achoto etzlo. He's on his deathbed, and his nephew comes in, his sister's son, comes to him and finds him crying. Matzo boche. Amarlo, he said to him, Rebbe, my teacher, mipnei ma'ata boche. And there are many conversations like this in the Talmud, of deathbed conversations, and people are asking the sages, why are you crying? What do you have to cry about? And what's behind this question is the understanding that if you lived a good life, then you have nothing to regret. Why would a person who has been such a holy person ever cry? Why would they ever cry at a time of death? Be proud of what you've done. Yesh Torah shelo lamadata v'limadata. Is there Torah that you haven't studied and taught? Harei talmidecha yoshvim lefanecha. Look at the students who are sitting right in front of you. You have nothing to worry about. You've built up a beautiful community of students. Yesh gemilut chasadim shelo asita. Do you have acts of kindness that you didn't do? Va'al kol midot shahayu b'cha. And all of the virtues that were in you, that you possess. Hayita mitrachek min hadayanim. You stayed away from being a judge, from acting as a judge. V'lo natata reshut al atzmacha lihitmano tzarchei tzibor. And you didn't permit yourself to get involved in communal behavior. And he's presenting this in communal needs, and he's presenting this almost as a virtue. Uncle, rabbi, you have nothing to worry about. You stayed away from the corruption. You stayed away from the problems. So he said, Amarlo. So Rabbi Ami or Rabbi Asi says to his nephew, Beni, my son, my child, Aleha ani boche. I'm crying specifically because of that. Shema etain din v'cheshbon. Maybe I'll be called to account. Al shahayit yachola so dineim shel Yisrael. Because I could have acted as a judge. I could have solved problems, and I didn't. And that's why I'm crying. Because I could have made a difference in that way, but I chose not to. Heve v'ish trumot yeharsena, and that's what the verse means when it says that a person of trumot, of separating themselves, will destroy the world of justice. So that's another example. So the Midrash, I think, makes a very powerful point, which is that as a member of society, one doesn't have the option of saying, okay, the whole world of Mishpatim. You know what Mishpatim is about? It's about causing harm to each other. It's about how to solve problems. But if I have nothing to do with other people, then I have no problems. Nothing. And so the Midrash says, no, don't be that person. Don't be the person who says Mishpatim are for people who get involved. I'm not going to get involved, and therefore I'll live a perfect life. And the Midrash Tanchuma in our Parasha says, no, you have to get involved, because otherwise, it's very powerful language. You are a person who destroys the world, who overthrows the world by not getting involved. So that's what I wanted to share today. I think a very for me, a very compelling look at Parshat Mishpatim, and seeing, number one, the focus on the language of placing the judgments or placing the rules in front of people. It's either the notion of being very appealing to the people in the way that we study Torah, or the idea of being selective in the way that we study Torah, as one midrash does. And then the second midrash, Tanchuma, which taught the notion of being engaged in the world as being an outcome of Mishpatim, of this concept of judgment and justice and laws and rules, is actually a call to action, not a call to avoid them, but a call to be involved in a very, very powerful way. I think every social justice organization probably knows this midrash, which says that a person who separates themselves destroys from society, destroys the world. If you think that, if you have the opportunity to be a judge and you say, not for me, don't want to get involved in people's problems, that in of itself is a major moral problem that the midrash presents to us. Any questions or comments as we close up? Stephen.
Yeah, just a question. When this man divided from society says, "What does it mean to me? Why should I care?" I can't get over the parallel with the Haggadah. It sounds exactly like the wicked son, almost the same words.
Yeah.
What does this mean to me?
Yeah, exactly. He takes himself out of the community. That's great.
What's two comments about language. It says to die, kashahaya mistalek min haolam. It's so descriptive in Hebrew, and in English it's just to die. The other thing I noticed, Rabbi, is that you refer to Arabic occasionally. So I wonder if you would like to give a course of learning Arabic.
Ooh, that would be a joy. My Arabic is very rusty, but when I was in university, I took Arabic for 3 years, and
Wonderful.
I did it as a Hebrew speaker, knowing that for Hebrew speakers you don't start in Arabic 101, kind of the basics of a language, of reading from right to left, of the idea of different letters appearing in a different way or looking differently depending on where they are in the word. Whether the beginning, the middle, or the end of the word. A lot of and of course, much of the language of the actual shorashim of the roots are very similar. And I studied, and the purpose of studying was really to study Maimonides, to study Jewish sources in the original, many of the writings in Arabic, Maimonides in Judeo-Arabic, the Guide to the Perplexed, and so on. But it's been many years, and but it's something I would like. It's a passion for sure. Any language, reading in the original is a passion. But I don't think I would be an equipped teacher. I'll say something else in just a moment. I'm going to stop the recording now because we're at the end of our class.